Most of the people who do come for singing lessons, not all, but most people, they come because they have some sense of affinity with the activity. Your voice deserves to be heard. And yes, there are the Beyoncés in the world. There are the Morissettes in the world. There are Gabrielle Henriques, these people who we've come to look to as being, wow, they're amazing. But I value just as highly the grandmother who is singing a lullaby to their grandchild while they go to sleep.
When you're young, you have a lot of resources physically, and you could just just spend them and just do a lot. But then the older person has an advantage over that. They don't just wildly and just randomly do things, but they're more intentional about it. So they're more focused.
The one thing that the teens and younger have over us, oldies, is time.
Daniel Robinson, also known as Dr. Dan, you may have come across his videos on YouTube if you are into singing. Now, he's a dear friend and colleague of mine from Australia, and I had a chat with him that dug a little bit deeper and got out a few things that you may not know yet. And I always think it's so interesting to get to know the stories behind someone who's in the singing world, whether it's a vocal coach, someone who has been performing. And here is the interview that I had with Daniel. I hope you enjoy it.
I teach 5 days a week, and what that looks like is very different to what it looked like when I started teaching nearly 30 years ago. I grew up in a very dogmatic, right-wing Christian household. My father particularly, but also my mother, did not allow secular music in the house. I had an affinity with music from a very, very young age. I really remember that. Sort of my teenage years, the formation years, the only thing that I was allowed to listen to was Christian music, except for when I was at school. I still remember going on a school excursion and listening to Dire Straits and just thinking they were awesome while we were listening to them on the bus, because that was a taboo. I was not allowed to listen to that in the house. A lot of people my age, they grew up listening to the Beatles. They grew up listening to Rolling Stones and, think of all those bands that you would expect to have listened to back then. I was not permitted that. My first year out of high school, I toured with a Christian ministry band. So the trajectory of my Christian upbringing kind of continued into my first year out of high school. I toured with a ministry band for 10 months. We lived out of a suitcase, traveling up and down the eastern seaboard of Australia. Very cool thing to do when you're 18. I opened my mouth and hoped for the best. I'd had a couple of years of classical private singing lessons, but they really didn't translate into what I found myself doing in front of this basically rock pop Christian band. Most of the people who do come for singing lessons, not all, but most people, they come because they have some sense of affinity with the activity. Your voice deserves to be heard. And yes, there are the Beyoncés in the world. There are the Morissettes in the world. There are Gabrielle Henriques, these people who we've come to look to as being, wow, they're amazing. But I value just as highly the grandmother who is singing a lullaby to their grandchild while they go to sleep.
What I've experienced is a lot of people, of course, think when you're young, it's easier to learn. That is true when it comes to just grasping new things. What I have seen the advantages of an older person, whether it's singing or anything else really studying, is when you're young, you have a lot of resources physically, and you could just just spend them and just do a lot. You just sing like Ed Sheeran. That's literally how he taught himself to sing. He just did a lot. He just sang and sang and sang and sang.
Yeah.
And he kept improving little by little. But then the older person has an advantage over that. They don't just wildly and just randomly do things, but they're more intentional about it. So they're more focused, And you have to kind of think when you're older, also as an athlete, probably, what am I going to do today that's actually going to make a difference instead of just exhausting yourself every single day? So, and I've seen there is just as much progress for someone who might be 80 years old than for someone who's 20 years old.
The one thing that the teens and younger have over us, oldies, is time. What we as older learners, we don't have the time. Oh my goodness, we don't have the time. But we do have other points of maturity that a young person simply doesn't even know exist yet. And that is organization of time and making our practice not necessarily a practice of quantity, but practice of quality.
Enjoy the process. It's not about an end goal, because when you reach that end goal, you will have a new goal. It's never like you're going to arrive at the final destination.
Yeah,
sure. I have to put in so much less work and still be really good than a lot of others. But I would love to hear your story. It's very interesting because for me, I had to learn how to teach a lot of things because they were never an issue for me. It was not easy to kind of find out, how do you teach someone to use vibrato or to sing on pitch? Because for me, those were never things I actually learned. I just knew how to do them.
I was, from a very young age, constantly recognized as a singer. Like you, the voice was always kind of not classical, but once I got into contemporary and I was doing jazz, I would walk away with not 100 out of 100 for all of my exams, but close to. And I didn't have to work all that hard, but there were things that I did want to be able to do with my voice that I didn't feel like I was receiving the tuition that I needed in the methodical, systematic way that I felt that I needed. In being an educator of music, specifically singing, because I also started when I was very young, I also used to teach guitar. I went about developing a systematic way of delivering that information so that anyone could step up to the plate and give it a good swing.
I think it is so interesting to ask someone about the background, and it's always fascinating to me how the way someone was brought up has such an influence on what they do later in life, and especially when it comes to music. This is my experience that the childhood experiences and how we were exposed to music has so much to do with what happens later in life and how easy it is for us to access music and how our brain works. Like for me, example, it's really hard for me to carry on a conversation when there's music in the background that has vocals especially in it, because part of my brain wanders off and consciously listens for all kinds of things. It's the teacher in me, it's the singer in me. I want to analyze, I listen to it. I can't just block it out. I could, but it's really hard because that is more interesting to me than the conversation usually. If you liked this interview and you want to see more that are about to come, hit the subscribe button, and I would love to welcome you back for the next interview. Be blessed, have a great day, and always dream big.